Would the attorney for the plaintiff please give his opening statement?
Thank you, Your Honor. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, my name is James Pennington. I'm the attorney for the plaintiff in this case, Mr. Robert Ramirez. I'd like to thank you all today for your service to your community in serving on this jury. You know, in the headlines today, we're reading a lot about cover-ups. Bureaucracies and law enforcement agencies that commit offenses against their citizens that they're supposed to serve, and then not coming clean with the truth about what they've done. This case is such a story of a law enforcement officer who made a terrible mistake and then didn't own up to the truth. This is also the story of the plaintiff, Mr. Ramirez. Mr. Ramirez is a family man. He's the husband to Maria and the father to Robert Jr. He's a hard-working union carpenter. His family's life was fairly uneventful until the night of December 6th, 1996. On that evening, it was a Friday evening, Mr. Ramirez had gotten off work. He decided to go to a friend's house. They were going to watch a ball game and play some cards. So they watched the game, had a few drinks, played some cards. Then they decided to go out in the town for a while. Then, as the evening was coming to a close, in the wee hours of the morning, Saturday morning, December the 7th, they decided to go to a local stadium and have a foot race. Just some good, clean fun with his buddies. It was getting very late. It was in the earlier hours of the morning. He decided to head home. But Mr. Ramirez never would make it home that evening. You see, as he left the stadium, he got in his vehicle, was headed home. As he was driving down Evergreen Avenue between California and Rockwell, he approached a vehicle in front of him that was driving very slowly, about 5 to 10 miles an hour. He decided he would pass this vehicle and make his way home. And he put on a signal, veered to the left. As he did, the vehicle in front of him veered to the left. So he went back to the right. As he did, the vehicle in front of him moved to the right. This happened a number of times. Mr. Ramirez began to get very frustrated. Finally, the vehicle ahead of him pulled over to the side and stopped. Mr. Ramirez pulled up alongside the vehicle and got out. He wanted to give his driver a piece of his mind. Well, he got out of his vehicle. Immediately thereafter, the driver of the other vehicle got out of his car. He approached Mr. Ramirez aggressively. They began exchanging words and then blows. The gentleman that got out of his vehicle was Officer Lacey of the Chicago Police Department. Mr. Ramirez didn't know this because the officer was in an unmarked car and was wearing plain clothes. And he did not identify himself, as Mr. Ramirez will testify, as an officer of the law. Well, Officer Lacey, who got out of the vehicle that was stopped, struck Mr. Ramirez in the face. He continued to attack and assault Mr. Ramirez. He knocked Mr. Ramirez to the ground and continued to beat him. It was only at that point that Officer Lacey identified himself as a police officer. Well, when Mr. Ramirez heard that, he was lying on the ground. He stopped and asked Officer Lacey for some identification. Right then, he felt a sharp pain in his left shoulder. He thought maybe someone had kicked him. But what had happened was, Officer Lacey's partner, Officer Waldman, shot Mr. Ramirez in the back. Now, Chicago Police Department policy, similar to the police department policy across most of the country, says you can only use deadly force as a last resort and only to protect the person and life of another officer. Well, the fact that Officer Waldman shot Mr. Ramirez and struck him in the shoulder is not in dispute in this case. The defendant admits that. Well, after Officer Ramirez was shot, he lay on the ground, unconscious. He was bleeding. He regained consciousness for a moment and heard someone say, "What should we do? Just leave him here?" Then Mr. Ramirez blacked out again. The next time he regained consciousness, he was in Cook County Hospital being attended by physicians. He had lost 4.5 pints of blood. He was in hypovolemic shock, a very dangerous situation that can lead to death. Well, it turns out Mr. Ramirez had to spend 2 weeks in the intensive care unit at Cook County Hospital. A total of 4 months in the hospital. Then, he wasn't able to return to work until a full 6 months after the shooting on the early morning hours of December the 7th. And once he did return to his work as a union carpenter, he wasn't able to perform the same tasks that he had before. He wasn't able to do a lot of the tasks as he could before. He couldn't play ball with Robert Jr. in the front yard as often as he'd like to. Well, the reason Mr. Ramirez is here is because he believes he needs to be made whole. He incurred extensive medical bills, months of lost wages, and frankly, he will never be the same. His life will never be the same. Now, the attorney for the defendant in this case will tell you a different story. He will tell you that basically, up to the time the two vehicles stopped, the story is pretty much the same. But there, he'll tell you other very interesting facts. He'll tell you that Officer Lacey saw Mr. Ramirez coming at him when he stopped his vehicle with a knife in his hand, a jackknife with the blade extended. He'll tell you that he was the aggressor against Officer Lacey. He will tell you that during this altercation, that Mr. Ramirez raised the knife with his right hand and stabbed Officer Lacey in the right shoulder. Of course, you will also hear testimony that Mr. Ramirez is left-handed. You'll also hear testimony that Mr. Ramirez never owned a knife of that sort. His wife will testify that she had never seen a knife of that sort in their home. You will also hear testimony that a knife was found at the scene on the pavement whenever other officers were called to respond to Officer Waldman's shooting of Mr. Ramirez. And that those officers found a knife closed on the ground. You will also hear testimony that that knife contained no traces of blood and no fingerprints whatsoever. You will also learn from testimony that the officers that responded to the scene had in their trunk evidence from a burglary that they had been investigating, and there happened to be a similar knife in their trunk. Now, your job as the jury will be to decide fact from fiction, to listen to each side of the story and see which is more reasonable, which is consistent with the actual facts of the case. Now, what we have here is a story of a police officer, an encounter with a police officer that went very wrong. And then the persons involved in the wrong, to my client, Mr. Ramirez, hiding the truth. I'd like to thank you very much for your service, and look forward to seeing you in the next few days.